Chapter 6, verses 19 to 21. It's printed in the bulletin if you'd like to read along. If not, feel free to just listen along. Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust consume and where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasure in heaven, where neither moth nor rust consumes, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will also be. You'll note on the next page our sermon title, Renovating Investment. We've been playing off the theme of the capital campaign of Renovate, talking about the fact that we're still in the midst of renovating. Literally upstairs, but continually within. If you ever think you've arrived and you know it all, that means you're in dangerous territory. There's still growing to do. There's still service to do. There are still ways to live your life. We are constantly renovating, spiritually speaking. There may be days to take a break, but there's never a day when the renovation process is over. In the newsletter this week, I shared some thoughts from Brian McLaren's book, which we're going to see a little bit more of today. We Make the Road by Walking. It's a great devotional. If you're looking for something, you can do this. It is something for every day. Elders, this may be a book for us to look at. We could do this for 3 or 4 years probably because we only meet once a month. It is an amazing guide. I told you how much I respect McLaren before. He just says things that make sense. And he says them from a perspective that isn't quite ours. You know, he comes from the evangelical church, and he's moved a little theologically speaking, but he still has the heart of the evangelical church within him. So now he thinks and feels. That's exactly who we are as disciples. Well, sometimes we think better than we feel the face. May it be that we can move a little, maybe continue as disciples to renovate. He says this: it is foolishness to live above your means. It is selfishness to spend all your money on yourself. It is godliness to give, to produce a surplus that is used for the commonwealth of God, which is an uprising not of greed, but of joyful generosity and creative stewardship. I love that phrase, joyful generosity. These are common sense words that challenge us and beg the questions. Do we need to make some changes in our giving so that we can know what it means to be joyfully generous? Our passage today from the Gospel of Matthew actually is the third for us, but it's kind of the middle of chapter 6. We started, you might remember, a couple of weeks ago with that passage that taught us how to live a little better, how to fast, how to give, how to pray. We started with that to talk about that we all have things that we can do, all that we can give a little differently. We talked about last week that passage that was about worry and lilies of the field and birds of the air, and how much time we spend worrying. Can we reorder our time a little differently? Today, we come to this conversation about money. This may be the hardest one of all. A couple of parts of this teaching that we didn't read is that right after the words we read, Jesus is talking about eyes and health, and that if we see well, then we're healthy. And if we're healthy, we're full of light. Right after that, he goes right back to money. Money, health, and being full of light, and money. He talks about that passage, a famous passage where you can't serve two masters. You will either love one and despise the other, or you'll be devoted to one and not serve the other. He ends that saying, you know it, you cannot love God and money. And then in our passage today, where we consider how it is that we can find our true heart, how it is that we can better understand where our treasure should be. I think it's more than just money. I think it's all the things that we've already talked about. I think it's time. I think it's treasure. I think it's talent. I think it's all of us. I think that God wants all of us. And if our heart is in the right place, then money will not take over our lives. Because you can't serve. And where your treasure is, there's your heart. I think the cynical side of us, being Americans in the 21st century, would be, oh yeah, God, up there in heaven, do you have any need for money? Does anyone have any need of money in heaven? As a comic once said, seems pretty important down here. Seems pretty important down here. We have things to save for. We have things, bills to take care of. What do? How do we take this call of faith that Jesus gives to us, that God gives to us, and live it as 21st century Americans? I think that's the trick. I think therein lies the rub. I mean, come on. We've been taught to save, to hoard, to keep. That's the American way. It's the foundation of our country, as many want to say. It's not really what John Locke was talking about when he set up the principles of what it meant to be a free society. But it's the way that they've been interpreted over the last couple of hundred years. We keep what we get. It's ours. We see someone on the street, well, they must deserve to be there. They're not working hard. If they work hard, then I give to them. That's not you. But it is a mentality. And you know that's true. So what do? We've been taught from the earliest ages to save. How old were you when you got your first piggy bank? 4? 3? 5? How many of you were born with a college fund? The younger you are, the more likely that happens for you. I was taught right out of seminary about a pension fund. And what about you? When did you learn about 401ks and retirement plans? Some of you are going to be arguing with the state about that a little later this week, I think. So we've been taught from an early age to keep. If Mary Stepanovich is cold, we have to turn that up. So we've been taught from an early age. The trick becomes, how do we move to a new place? How do we move to a new place? How do we begin to feel this understanding of being joyfully generous? Have you ever been out of the country on a mission trip? I know that some of you have. I've been fortunate enough to go to several places, and you know what seems to be the case every time? I see people who have little who seem happier than we do here in the States. It was true in Mexico, in Honduras, in Africa. People who have very small places to live. People who have very little access to education. People who have no hope for money value things a little differently than we do. Their faith is strong. They value God. They value their family. Family is almost the center of their existence. think sometimes we get it wrong. I think sometimes we're a fractured people. So how do we do it differently? How do we live this call from Jesus and from God to be joyfully generous? There's a church in Oklahoma where my dad goes, First Christian Church of Claremore, Oklahoma. And they have a minister named Charles Ragland. And Charles has been putting on his Facebook page quotes from someone that he's been reading as he's preparing his congregation for this very day. We're not alone. Every church has this day. He's been quoting a man by the name of Robert Schnace. And he has this guide called Practicing Extravagant Generosity. Listen to some of the quotes that Charles has been sharing with his church. Where God's Spirit is present. Where God's Spirit is present, people give. No stories from Scripture tell of people living the God-related spiritual life while fostering a greedy, self-centered, self-serving attitude. Knowing God leads to generosity. Second quote. Every sanctuary and chapel in which we have worshipped, every church organ that has lifted our spirits, every pew where we have sat, even these white chairs, every hymnal from which we have sung, every praise band that has touched our hearts, every church classroom where we have gathered with our friends, every church kitchen that has prepared our meals, every church van that has taken us to camp, every church camp cabin where we have slept. All of these things are fruit of someone's extravagant generosity. We owe the same to generations to come. And then last but not least, churches that cultivate giving. Churches that cultivate giving speak of joy, devotion, honoring God, and the steady growth of spirit that leads to greater generosity. Just think of those words a little bit. Do they make sense to you? Do they connect with you? Do they help you think about how to do things maybe a little differently? I've always bragged on you. I've always bragged on you. Because of your generosity. We've had this capital campaign, and at trustees and at board meeting last week, you know what we heard? We heard that we've taken in 65% of what was promised to the capital campaign. 65%, yes, Jack, that is cool. You guys might not have heard that on that side. We only have 35% left to get. Is it possible we might go over what we expected to get? It is. It is possible. Is it possible that some may have already completed their pledge, and as we come into the stewardship campaign, are ready to maybe do a little more than normal with their stewardship giving? That is a possibility. You see, this day isn't about forcing money out of your wallet or asking you to write a bigger check. This day, this whole campaign, this renovating campaign is about your faithfulness to your God. That's all it's about. It's between you and God. It's an uncomfortable conversation sometimes. I have to tell you, it's uncomfortable for me. And yet, we would be remiss if we didn't have the conversation. Thinking about our whole life, this day money, but in the previous weeks, time and talent. How can we use all of our being to say to God, I want to follow you. I want to do what you ask me to do. I want to be your faithful servant. I want to give thanks to you for always being faithful to me. McLaren, he gives us a guide. He gives us a guide for being joyfully generous, for helping us to get to the kind of stewardship that Shnace was talking about, that Charles Radlin shared from one of our sister churches in Claremore, Oklahoma. He says that we can do this because when it comes to how we spend our earnings, stewardship means living below our means. McLaren says that we should divide our money into 3 pools. First, we determine a percentage for taking care of our needs and the needs of our families. Second, he says, we determine a percentage to save, as he says, since wisdom requires foresight. And then third, he says, we set aside the largest portion we can for God's work, for compassion and justice and restoration and peace. McLaren goes on to tell us that Paul says that nothing has any value without love. Nothing has any value without love. McLaren says that stewardship is really love in action. Think about those things. Stewardship is really love in action, and that nothing has value without love. Where your heart is, there will your treasure also be. McLaren goes on to say that that's why money is so deceptive. It deceives people into misunderstanding what is truly valuable. You cannot serve 2 masters, Jesus taught. That's what McLaren goes on to say. If you love God, you will hate money, because money always gets in the way of loving God. He also says, if you love money, you will hate God, because God always gets in the way of loving money. My friends, being faithful to God with everything we have creates that spirit, that understanding, that life of being joyfully generous. Let these be considerations beyond today. Let these be considerations for every day. But may they focus us especially on this day called Fulfillment Sunday. We received in the mail, if you are a member of the church, you get letters from us. You received an estimate of giving card. We ask you to bring that to worship today. We want this time to be an act of worship. We want this to be a moment of prayer for you to have this opportunity to consider, with God's help, what you will do for your church this year. How can you serve your church with your time and with your talent and with your money? That is on your estimate of giving card. All of those are opportunities for you. We're hopeful that you will fill that out today if you haven't already. We're hopeful that we can understand this idea of being, and if you filled one out and already given them to the office, because that has happened. That's okay. We still want you to fill one out here as an act of worship. So raise your hands high for those who need estimate giving cards. In a moment, we're going to give you the opportunity to fill these out. If you've already filled it out and brought it to worship with you, we want you to sit with that in prayer. This whole moment is about being in prayer together as a community, as we individually consider how to use best our time, talent, and treasure. Thank you for taking the time to do this today. On behalf of all of you, I say thank you to all of you. This is ministry we share together. This is the turning on of lights, yes, but it's also the helping at the Salvation Army. It's also the helping at Loaves and Fishes. It's also helping those who come in off the streets. It's educating our children in the ways of faith. It's providing youth and college age groups. It's providing children's groups. It's providing a children's ministry moving forward. That's what this time is for. How can we volunteer? How can we give of our whole selves? So let us be in an attitude of prayer. Let us consider these things as we come into this time of consideration.